Hi, everybody. Welcome, Coach. I'm not sure how to say your last name. I'm sorry.
Sliger.
That's what I thought. That's what I thought. I apologize. Welcome,
No, you're
Coach
good.
Sliger, to the podcast. Coach, what got you into coaching?
So for me, this is actually going to be my 10th year in coaching overall. When you combine, being a head coach and an assistant coach. For me, I had the
Mhm.
opportunity to go play after high school up at Anderson University for a little bit. Was then at a point in time where, obviously the career kind of steps into play and ended up transferring away to finish my degree over at Indiana University East. For me, still wanting to be a part of the game and get back to the game. I was given an opportunity by Coach McMurray at the time, who was the head coach at Rushville. Now he's back up at New Pal as the defensive coordinator. He's one that really gave me a lot of unique opportunities early on that somebody as a 19, 20-year-old probably doesn't usually get. Um,
Mhm.
really, more than anything, it was just wanting to get back to the game. And then on top of that, being around, where I was from, obviously, as an alumni there at Rushville.
Mhm. Okay. Okay. So, as you know about the new transfer rule, how will you adapt?
Really, from kind of what I've gathered here so far, I don't know how much it'll necessarily affect us here at Greensburg. We're kind of outside the big bubble, obviously, when you kind of look around the metro area. We do have, obviously North and South Decatur here local in our
Mhm.
county. And then obviously we've got a few other schools in our conference that are relatively close. But from an actual in-county standpoint, none of our schools necessarily like block any transfers. And that's
Mhm.
so that part's a little bit different. So when you kind of compare that to what's been done and the new rules with it, I don't think that aspect changes much for us. Obviously, you get transfers from time to time just because of like Honda being here and the expansion that they're kind of working on
Mhm.
with it. But I really think it's just one of those things where uh, for us it doesn't change as much. Obviously, the schools that are located. I know you're from like around the Lafayette area. You've got a lot of
Yep.
schools that are pretty well centrally located. That's going to be a lot different of an answer for. The schools that are around those metro areas. You've got to. It kind of almost to me seems like you've kind of got to do what like the Columbus area and like some of those other areas are, where you've got to really get a hold of them at an early age. But
Mhm.
then continue to build the relationships. I mean, that's what this is all about, anyways. Is how good relationships do you have with kids, and are they willing to? Not are they willing to? Are they able to see the willingness that you're willing to put into them?
What's your stance on analytics in high school football?
I believe in analytics. I think it's still, I think there's a driving force behind it. Do I think necessarily there's as much information at this level as to what you're now seeing kind of transpose at the college level? No. I don't know if we'll ever necessarily get to that degree for a variety of reasons. I think anyone that's not using them still at this level, even on just, we get on Huddle now and everything, utilizing those for our reports, that's still using analytics. I think that's a baseline that everyone should be able to utilize just, from what's been given to us at our fingertips. But, it puts kids in better situations. Obviously, they're able to understand things when you break down everything. And then
Mhm.
as a coaching staff, when you're able to put together your plans, I think that's critical.
How do you scout opponents without a large staff? I know Greensburg is real small, but not really. It's kind of in the middle.
Yeah, so I guess I'll kind of answer this in two ways. When I was at Rushville, we had a staff of about 7 or 8 every year. Now our staff actually here at Greensburg this fall will be about 14 or 15, which is the largest that I've ever had. But again, that's kind of a combination of a few things. We can get into that later. But first and foremost, obviously, there's an experience factor behind, what guys are able to take on workload and everything else. When you have a smaller staff, you've got to kind of dive in and separate either into 3 or 4 on one side, 3 or 4 on the other. Or I've been on staffs that had about 6 altogether when I was an assistant, and you had to have hands in both fires. So that again is one piece of it, where you're able to differentiate and kind of, assign guys specific tasks of what you want and, what your coordinators want. For us, what we'll now be able to get into, obviously, when you have 15 guys on staff, you can really dive into a lot more finite details, than what I've been able to in the past outside of, with reports and everything else. But we'll have about 7 or 8 guys on both sides, and then both coordinate. Well, I'll coordinate the offense, but both coordinators, though, for those sides are then able to break down specific tasks with each individual. So, I like to kind of break up our offensive special teams units with our offensive staff, defensive with the defensive staff. So, really, it kind of helps balance the workload, which again, then you kind of dive into the whole, work-life balance of what what high school athletics have really gotten into now. I think that also helps our staff. And then it also helps the kids because things are able to be kind of diagrammed a little bit easier too.
Absolutely. How do you evaluate talent at positions like a line or corner?
Yeah. So, again, given this example where, it's anytime you come in somewhere and you're bringing a new system, you obviously have, certain expectations of where you can see guys fitting into your system. But also at the end of the day, I feel like you've got to be able to mold and model your system after the guys that you have, especially again at this level where you're not, going hand picking guys, and you're not able to recruit guys for that. So really, based on what your system implies, if you're somebody that, a few years ago when we were more of like the Tennessee style, offense where we had a lot of receiving types, being able to balance, the vertical speed and creating, separation downfield. Can you win one-on-ones? Can you win the explosive battles? Running back wise, again, kind of depends on what you do. For us, we believe in power football. We still like to have a different variety of guys. We like the thumper types, but we also like the guys that can one cut in the middle of the field and win one-on-ones. So I think for anybody, it really kind of depends on what your scheme is, what you value and prioritize in your scheme, which again is going to be a loaded question for anybody, obviously. But I think for us, from a receiver standpoint, you got to be able to block. Obviously, you've got to be able to win one-on-ones. You've got to create separation at the line of scrimmage. I think for us, with what we do, more than anything, the quarterback position. And I know that's going to be that for everybody, but we put a lot on our quarterbacks to make sure that they get us in and out of into good plays and out of bad plays, and being able to kind of direction everything that, not a lot of people necessarily put on a 15 to 18-year-old. Some choose to do different things. We put a lot on their plate to be able to do that. But we also make sure that we prep them in that process. So for us, you've got to make sure that, number one, you show up every day. Like that's non-negotiable for that position. Again, are you vocal? Are you willing to take command? If you're not going to be able to command everything, then you can't play that position. So we kind of have a breakdown of what we kind of expect from guys, but obviously at the end of the day, it's not we've still got to adapt. That's what I'm saying.
So, what's your opinion on receiver type guys playing defensive line?
As far as like a receiver playing defensive end?
No, like nose tackle.
That's not what we do. Again, everybody has their own, opinions and everything like that. But, for us, we're more of an even front. We really try to, we really want, a stud 3 tech for us, which is obviously going to be able to command double teams. And, we've had a variety of one techniques over the years. Most of them for us are pretty similar to those 3s, where we really just want to be able to put pressure on our centers or opposing centers, and be able to get gap penetration. So I can't say that I've ever necessarily had one that, we've put from a receiver position to a nose. I know that, at one point in time, it was very common to put those, 145, 150-pound wrestling types. That was more of, I think, late 80s into the 90s type of thing, and maybe early 2000s. I think from an offensive standpoint, the game's changed a lot, and you're not necessarily utilizing those same type of offenses that you would today. Most of your receiver types today are probably going to be your corners and safeties, depending on, again, what your scheme is. But I know, at least for us, we've never had that. But yeah.
How do you decide when to move a player to a new position?
Right now, again, I'll give just the example of where we're at. The spring and really early summer for us is kind of an evaluation period, especially because, this is the first time that I've really seen a lot of these guys, from a practice standpoint, understanding how they practice, what they're good at, what we need to improve on, things like that. So, right now we've kind of got some guys that, you can kind of pencil in of, hey, we think he fits here in our system. But until we actually see it, going against competition in practice, going against guys in scrimmages, you don't always get, obviously, that confirmation. So right now, that to me is kind of in the spring and then into the summer once you start scrimmaging teams. But part of that, again, goes back to the competition piece. If somebody's out competing them and doing a better job, then obviously if they're still an athlete and we feel like they can help us, that may be in a different spot. I think that comes generally probably more on the defensive side of the ball, of being able to kind of fluidly move guys a little bit easier. Obviously some systems can kind of change with that, and you can still see that some on the offensive side of the ball, but I think that's a lot easier on the defensive side still. But
What's your favorite? What drills do you swear by for receivers?
So honestly, somebody that I looked a lot at was Brennan Marion, who now just took over at Sacramento State. He was a receiver coach for a long time. If there was a period of time he was at Texas, he was over at Pitt. Last year he was at UNLV. The guy that does the go-go offense. But it's a lot of footwork separation. For us, again, we do a lot of one-on-one high point. We call it contested catch. But we really try to focus on, again, because of what we, trying to take vertical shots and everything else, we've got to be able to create separation of the line of scrimmage, because we are going to see teams that try to press us and try to get in our face. We've also, got to be able to win the one-on-one. So contested catch, being able to high point the football, being able to redirect to the football, and then being able to explode after the fact. So in that position for us, it's really, more the contested catch one-on-ones. But that's, again, what we do from a passing game standpoint.
Okay. How do you prepare a freshman to contribute on varsity?
I think more than anything, I've really only, from a head coach standpoint, my first year we played, about 18 freshmen and sophomores. That kind of came, just from a culture standpoint of, they beat guys out, they worked their tails off, and they did what it took. Obviously, over the last 4 years, those guys built that into being able to win a conference championship last year. Outside of that specific situation, I can probably say I've only had a couple kids as true freshmen that, have truly went out and won early and showed why. A lot of those early on for us were, as the season progressed, they took those jobs over. But part of it is obviously a build standpoint. Not a lot of freshmen look like what they should to be able to play on a Friday night, and that's just normal. But I think the other part's a mental factor. Being able to process in that type of role what you need to do for your job is not easy necessarily as a 14 or 15-year-old kid. So being able to put them in a position to succeed, for example, if you've got a kid that, could contribute from an offensive defensive line standpoint, well, long term, he may be an interior guy for us. He may be able to play a 3 tech for us down the line. As a freshman, is that necessarily where he's going to be best fit? Probably not. He's probably going to be better fit in our scheme. Is probably more of a defensive end type, as a strong end, or possibly as a weak end, depending again on size, frame, what he excels at. That does a couple things. One, workload wise, going against tight ends compared to interior guards and tackles is a much different task at hand. And that puts that kid in a better situation to be successful as well. If it's a kid that possibly does play both sides as a freshman, that doesn't happen very often. If it is that type of situation, again, how can you balance that workload with what you do schematically? You don't want to overwork them mentally because, again, they're 14, 15-year-old kid, and not very many can process that the way that you need to have success at a high level. Some can. I think that's, again, a kid-by-kid basis, but I think you as a coach have to do what you can to put them in a position to be successful early on more than anything.
Absolutely, Coach. How do you simplify your playbook without dumbing it down?
So we, a lot of it I think comes from a verbiage standpoint. I kind of laughed at it for a while. Like you kind of sit and listen to guys like Sean Payton's an example, where you'll hear play calls and they're just a mile long. Well, how can you? There's a couple ways about this. When you look at that type of a system, they're spelling everything out to simplify it for every single specific position. We hear it as a casual fan on the couch or anything, and you hear this mile long play, and it's like, what the heck? So you have that mindset for some philosophies. The other philosophy is you basically condense everything verbiage wise into 1 or 2 word play calls, and everyone just understands off of that. That can be including the formation. That can be, separating the formation and then into the play. That can be condensing everything, including play direction into that. Everybody's getting a little bit different. That to me is kind of the 2 modes philosophically behind it all. And we've done both. We've, again, like what I said, when we were the running gun tempo, it was, we've got to condense verbiage. It's all signals and everybody knows just off of those things. We've also done the whole shifting, motioning, slowing the game down, but doing a lot of things to kind of put stress on a defense. That obviously creates a little bit more verbiage in play. So without going into a lot more with that, I think it again kind of depends on your philosophy with it.
Okay. What's your approach to player mental health?
I think it's something that really has not come to, like, how should I phrase this? I don't think it was anything that really came to light up until probably the last 5 or 6 years, but it's still something that I think has hung around. And I think that it's something that everybody knew about, but nobody really knew, if that makes sense. So I think, again, there's the understanding, especially with the way the high school sports have really transpired into, where it's almost year round, 24/7 for everything. I think we forget sometimes to remember what's best for the kid. I think we get into situations as coaches where selfishly, we want what's best for us and what's best for our program. But we've also got to sit back and remember that, first off, what's best for the kid, what's best for our school, what's best for our community. The best thing in play for that is for that kid to be able to go for 4 years and excel, play with their kid, play with their teammates that they've grown up with, play for their community and represent that for 4 years. So I think that's one thing that we've got to acknowledge as coaches is that it's, we can't be selfish about that. And I think that's something that as continuous pressure gets put on those major sports coaches, that kind of hangs over. I think it really goes back to, as an athletic department and as a group of head coaches, being on the same page of putting the kids first, working a schedule out together as grown adults. And then obviously just being able to build a relationship with them to, for them to feel comfortable being able to come and talk to you. That I think those are all things that we don't always think of or haven't always thought of. But trying to prioritize that, I think that's a situation that, since I've been down here at Greensburg, we've done a really great job of. Our head coaches work really well together. Our athletic department is really well ran, and everybody's on the same page with that. And I think, we see the results from it from the kids. The kids, again, feel more comfortable coming to talk to you about things. They're a lot more at ease because they understand that, there's not this year-round pressure of having to do every single thing 24/7 and not just be a kid. But that to me is the biggest thing and again, I get it. Like, I want to win just as much as everybody else, but I do also think we've got to sit back and say that, 12 opportunities in the spring aren't going to be what make or breaks you come August, September, October, November.
Absolutely. And any player, any athlete, student athlete, remember this. If you are struggling, get help. You will feel so much better about yourself.
Yeah.
Coach, what are your core team values?
I think for us, we have to have, first and foremost, again, when you come into a new program, and even when you have one established, I always feel like it starts in the weight room first, especially from a football standpoint. And that's kind of the grueling part of football. You get done in November, and basically the Monday after Thanksgiving, you're back on the clock. That's when everybody's back into the weight room, and for 8 months, that's what you do. It's 3-4 times a week in the weight room, and it is just the continuous process that nobody really sees, pays attention to. But at the end of the day, you win in the trenches. At the end of the day, the strength part, is what your foundation has to be built on, in my opinion. I would argue that with all sports, not just football, but that's what we do. So first and foremost, we're going to win in the weight room first. Outside of that, we want to be able to develop great young men. We want to be able to develop great young men that are going to be great spouses, are going to be great father figures, and then ultimately are going to be able to give back to their community. Even if it's not Greensburg, wherever they decide to settle down with their family at some point in time, go be involved in that community. And then from there, just the toughness factor. I feel like we live in a society today that doesn't always, hold people accountable to the standard that I feel like we should. I think we've kind of laxed in that a lot, and there's a variety of reasons behind that, and that's a whole other conversation. But for us, we're going to hold you accountable. You're going to be held accountable. You're going to be disciplined, and you're going to be a tough-minded individual. Saying is toughest team wins. That's a physical standpoint. That's a mental standpoint, an emotional standpoint. So that would summarize everything for us, I think, when you kind of consolidate all of that.
All right, Coach, we're going to get into some shenanigans here.
Okay.
Who inspired you to be a coach?
So, first and foremost, I would say, I've always been a football fan. From a pure, fan of football growing up as a Colts fan, obviously you sit and watch, I grew up in the Tony Dungy era. So, excuse me. So that was a big one. I've had a few opportunities to be able to listen to him speak, and how his approach was obviously in Tampa and then obviously here in Indy. So there was always that part. But as far as close to home, it'd have to be Chris Mikowski, who was my high school coach up until my senior year. He's actually currently the head coach up at Peru High School. He's one that when I actually went off to college, had a couple research papers that I actually did all of this about the coaching industry. And, he's one in particular that I still talk to weekly. Sometimes every couple of days, depending on, how things are going and everything. But he's one that I've really tried to model myself after a lot, in regards to mentality, in regards to, being able to take a step back from things. I think as coaches too, we really struggle, with the whole mindset of, if the world ran the way that we as head football coaches would run it, everything would be great. And it doesn't work like that. There are things that we can't control, and we can't overreact to those things. And we can't just be mad at the world because something didn't go right.
Right.
He's one in particular, though, that I've always really tried to model myself after and kind of just lean into him a little bit. Obviously, again, early on, when I was a 19-year-old kid, Scott McMurray, giving me the opportunities that he gave me at such an early age, put me in a position to where I am today. So he's another one that again, being able to learn from him for that period of time, I'm extremely, extremely grateful for. And then obviously over at Shelbyville too, when I was with Mike Clevenger for a little bit, he's one that again showed me a lot, gave me a lot of opportunities at a young age that, without those three guys, I don't have near the connections. I don't have near, I wouldn't have learned nearly what I would have. And then since I've become a head coach, being able to tap into those resources, Luke Amstutz up at East Noble, Steve Stern over here at North, has been a phenomenal mentor. And we sit and talk weekly as well with that. Just you start to really dive in once you get into it, and the further you progress, you really start to understand the type of fraternity that, being a head football coach is, and the guys that go through what you go through. You don't always know that early on. But it's a willingness, and it's like a brotherhood, and just being able to rely on guys and reach out to guys and say, hey, can you help me with this? But those would be the ones, from a short list standpoint. There's obviously more, but those would probably be the highest.
What's your biggest pet peeve?
Laziness. I'm again a big attention to detail guy. And it's little things to me. And it's one of those that, you show up to work early and on time. You give the consistent effort. You don't just show up. You show up with a purpose and a plan. That's one of the hardest things in the world that I feel like we do is, we're a team that goes early in the morning. Not a lot of teams can do that. Not a lot of people can do that. Number one, it prepares you for life after football. Number two, if you're able and willing to consistently get up every single day to go do what we need to do, I mean, that again is the hard part. Showing up is the hard part. Now it's having the plan and having the purpose behind what you're doing. That to me would be the biggest thing. If you show up and you're willing to work and you're willing to make the sacrifices, we've seen it unfold before. Like that's where champions really start to rise out of it.
All right, Coach. My final question to this episode is, what's your favorite sports movie?
Favorite sports movie? I would say probably Remember the Titans would be up there. I'd say probably Remember the Titans. I'm not a big movie guy, so that's kind of a win for me. I get a lot of flack for that, but I kind of have a wheelhouse, and it's basically like Star Wars, Marvel, some sports stuff, depending on what it is. But outside of that wheelhouse, I don't watch a ton of movies. But I'd say probably Remember the Titans. I know that's probably a cliche answer. That's not normally what I'd be about, but that's all right.
We'll be perfect in every aspect of the game. You drop a pass, you run a mile. All right. My name is Brian Jones. He's Isaac Sliger. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for having me.